Okay, well, I think we can just go ahead and get started and let people filter in. So I want to welcome everyone to this special session of the Funding Futures program. Funding Futures is PCA's new training and grant program for 6 Hudson Valley Fellows. We have given them a grant to run listening campaigns in their towns and to really understand what their residents, what's important to them in terms of environmental projects and place. So this process includes events, outreach to their community, a ballot process to understand who's behind which ideas that are proposed during these listening campaign events. And it will determine which projects are prioritized that the community can take forward. So we also bring in weekly guest speakers for the fellows, and we've invited you in for this special session with Carli because we feel like many people could benefit from understanding about the real estate transfer tax and the community preservation fund and planning. So this we also bring together our cohort around peer-to-peer learning. So anyway, I'll let Vanessa explain more and welcome everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. So, yes, for this session, we decided to open it up more to all of you beyond our cohort for Funding Futures. And we're glad to see so many people interested in this topic. At PCA, we really believe that the overlapping ecological crises are best addressed by the communities that are closest to them, using approaches that honor the uniqueness of each place. And so we're really interested in community preservation planning and funds because these methods reflect a community's values and the desires of a particular place and people. And furthermore, the real estate transfer tax creates an actual funding mechanism in an ongoing manner to make those desires a reality. And that's very rare indeed. So we're thrilled today to be hosting Carli Fraccarolli, Government Relations Manager at Scenic Hudson. Carli has extensive experience in government relations and environmental advocacy and is currently serving as the um, uh, she's been serving in that role since May 2019. Prior roles at Scenic Hudson include state policy manager, state policy coordinator, and advocacy associate. Previous experience includes a position as database assistant at the New York Natural Heritage Program, where Carli specialized in invasive species data management. And additional roles also include media and communications intern at the Cornell Small Farms Program. And she was co-president of the Epsilon Eta Sustainable Fraternity and a water systems designer with Cornell University's Sustainable Design program. And that also included a project in Ghana, which is really amazing. So thank you so much for Carli for joining us. I'm happy to have her here also as a neighbor and a friend. She is on my Climate Smart task force in the village of Rhinebeck, where she, fun fact, leads our amphibian migration and road crossings project each spring. And perhaps most relevant for today's session, Carli has helped 5 municipalities pass the community preservation funds successfully. So, Carli, take it away.
Thank you so much, Vanessa and Paige and PCA. And it's so great to see all of you in your little squares. I see some friendly, familiar faces. So hello to those who I know, and good to meet you to those who I do not. I'm going to start sharing my screen here and we'll jump into my presentation. I'm really excited to talk to you about community preservation funds. If you're in a conversation with me, I'll probably bring them up at some point. So I'm glad to be having a little bit here to talk to you today about them. So thank you, Vanessa, for the wonderful introduction of me. I just wanted to introduce Scenic Hudson a little bit briefly. Our mission is to sustain and enhance the Hudson Valley's inspirational health and beauty for generations to come. And part of that mission is to conserve land and help others do so. And we also engage communities and assist with assessing conservation finance options. So that's why I'm here today talking to you, because the Community Preservation Fund is one of the ways that we can achieve local land conservation in the Hudson Valley. So let's start with what a community preservation fund is. It's a pot of money dedicated to solely conservation, mainly funded by a real estate transfer tax. And a real estate transfer tax is a one-time payment by the purchaser of a home that goes into a dedicated fund. In this case, that would be the Community Preservation Fund. And that real estate transfer tax under current local authorizing law can be up to 2% of the purchase price of the home. So anytime someone buys a home in a municipality with a community preservation fund, funds will be directed to the CPF. So it generates this dedicated revenue stream for conservation. And the Community Preservation Fund can be used for a wide variety of things. If you in your community have determined that you really need to conserve land along critical waterways, for example, or drinking water sources, the Community Preservation Fund can be used for that. It can also be used to preserve viable agricultural lands or high value soils. And it can also be used for the preservation of historic places and properties. So that's an interesting caveat. It's not just environmental resources, it's also historic resources within your town as well. And then up to 10% of the fund can be used for the stewardship of the land that you actually use the Community Preservation Fund to protect. So it's a small amount, but there is a little bit to, once you preserve the land, to keep it maintained and keep it stewarded. Now, why pursue a community preservation fund in your community? We have been seeing, and I'm sure many of you have as well, there are a lot of people currently post-pandemic moving out of cities into more rural areas. And here in the Hudson Valley, we're surrounded by rural areas. So the Community Preservation Fund can be used to protect open spaces from development when needed. Community preservation funds can also be helpful when municipalities have a lack of local funds. We've seen a lot of municipalities just not have two pennies to rub together in terms of trying to preserve land within the bounds of their municipality. So the Community Preservation Fund can provide the revenue to do so, and also serve as a match to county and state and even potentially federal conservation funds. So CPS can be used to leverage larger funding sources to have that much of a greater impact. Community preservation funds are also an investment in the future of your community. So you can build resiliency now by passing a CPF so that you don't have to react to issues down the line. And if you do, you'll be prepared. So say a developer comes in and a piece of property comes on the market and the developer wants to purchase it to put some kind of commercial development or whatever it may be, but your community has identified that parcel as high conservation value and you have the money to purchase that property, you'll be able to react in time instead of having to scramble to try to figure out ways to preserve the land, to keep the land preserved. And then finally, if your municipality has strong rural character, a couple of the municipalities I've worked with in the past have had a lot of active working farms, and they've wanted to keep that farmland and farming. Community preservation funds can be used to do that as well. So I wanted to start out with a couple of success stories and ways that municipalities that have passed CPS have used the money to preserve properties in their communities. And one of those is Red Hook in Dutchess County. The town of Red Hook passed their CPF back in 2006. And since then, they've raised over $6 million. And they've used this money to conserve a lot of the properties within the town, including a lot of farmland. And specifically, they recently put a portion of those funds towards the purchase of two properties. They're called Cookingham East and West. So you may have heard of the town of Red Hook's Cookingham project. That's what this is. And these two properties total over 170 acres, and they will be used for farming and recreation. And then they have also set aside 12 acres of one of the conserved properties for affordable housing. Another story that I wanted to present was the town of Marbletown in Ulster County. They passed their Community Preservation Fund in 2022. And in its first year, Marbletown's CPF raised $300,000. And that qualified the town for a $500,000 matching state grant. So allowing them to use their CPF with the matching state grant for the first time to purchase the Osterhout Flats property from the Open Space Institute in 2024. So how it worked was OSI permanently protected the property in 2023, and then they held on to the land until the town could acquire it using funds from their CPF. So this one is a really great example of not only a town leveraging their CPF funds with other matching funds, but also working with a regional partner to help them preserve the land. So the partner came in and was able to and had the capacity to preserve the land and hold on to it until the town could make those funds up and pay OSI for it. And then finally, and most recently, the city of Kingston passed their Community Preservation Fund in 2024. And earlier this year, so this was just last year, and now earlier this year, they closed on a 70-acre parcel in the Rondout Uplands region of Kingston that will ultimately be offered to the public as accessible open space. And this is the city's first major open space acquisition. And also it was the largest unprotected intact forest remaining in the city. So this is a huge conservation win for the city of Kingston. Kingston, I'll also mention, was the first city to have a community preservation fund. So it's a really interesting instance of urban conservation. And how this worked, because this parcel was acquired so recently after their community preservation fund, is they actually unanimously voted to authorize the purchase and the associated bond necessary to do so. And then the city is planning to repay the bond with CPF monies. So that's another way that they were able to use CPF monies, or the fact that they were going to have CPF monies to purchase a property. So why a real estate transfer tax? Why do all of this in this way? And what benefit does this have over other methods of conservation financing? Well, a real estate transfer tax is a sustainable source of revenue. There's always money coming in, like I mentioned, whenever somebody purchases a home in your municipality, money will be directed towards the CPF for conservation purposes. A real estate transfer tax also doesn't increase taxes for residents. So when a CPF is passed, residents will not experience a new property tax. And it's kind of interesting to think about, because when you tell somebody that it's a real estate transfer tax, somebody thinks tax, but it's really a one-time fee, if you will, on the purchase of a home that's traditionally paid by the buyer. And there's also an opportunity to build in an exemption for home purchases below a certain threshold. But I'll talk about that more in a bit. And then finally, we look at real estate transfer taxes as an investment of the buyer in the community that was attractive to the buyer in the first place. So for example, if a person is moving from a more urban area to a rural area and they love passing horses every day on their way to work, or taking their dog on long walks through fields and forests, they're investing in the municipality and the natural resources that drew them there. And then they will be able to invest in the future of their children when they grow up in these communities. So it's really, we're looking at this long-term investment. And I wanted to show very briefly the town of New Paltz, when they were working on their Community Preservation Fund campaign, they put together this spreadsheet of real estate transfer tax estimates, how much they would get based on the level of transfer tax that was implemented in New Paltz. So say they went for 2%, they passed a 2% real estate transfer tax, and then a home sells at $600,000. That's $10,000 going into a CPF. Just like that, in one go, you have $10,000 to be able to put towards the conservation of a property. So I can share these slides after so you can dig more into this, but just wanted to give a very brief example. So now we've talked about what a community preservation fund is, what it can do, all the great things it can do. Now let's figure out how to get it done. So in New York State, communities do need permission from the state to establish a community preservation fund. So there is a law currently on the books that gives blanket authority to establish community preservation funds, and that's the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act that you'll see on the slide here. And what that does, it authorizes communities to implement a real estate transfer tax, create a community preservation fund, use the fund to implement a community preservation plan that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and then acquire interests in rights in real property in accordance with the plan and the fund. But unfortunately, the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act right now only covers Westchester, Putnam, and Ulster counties and the municipalities therein. So if you're not within those 3 counties, another way to do a community preservation fund in your municipality is to have independent standalone authorization from the state. And the 5 communities that I've highlighted here that have just popped up, Red Hook, Warwick, and Chatham, and Northeast and Fishkill, they all have independent authorization. The first 3, Red Hook, Warwick, and Chatham, got independent authorization back between like 2006 and 2008, and they've all passed community preservation funds at this point. But Northeast and Fishkill have the authorization independently, but have not passed CPFs yet. And that brings me to this map of authorization that I wanted to show. I know it's a lot, but it shows the entire Hudson Valley. And in red there, you'll see municipalities that do not have authorization to establish a CPF. In blue, you'll see the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act authorized municipalities. So there's Westchester, Putnam, and Ulster counties there. In orange, there's those 2, Northeast and Fishkill and Dutchess County, that have independent authorization but haven't passed CPFs yet. And then in green, there's the municipalities that have established CPFs, and a lot of them have been happening in Ulster recently, but we also see Chatham recently up in Columbia County. So again, I will share this map afterwards so you can take a look more in depth. So if your municipality is not covered by the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act, it doesn't have standalone authority, you're in that red category on that map, what can you do? Well, the process is longer and it's a little bit more difficult, but it is still possible. And it starts with having conversations and just talking about community preservation funds and what they could do within your community. And you can start at the community level, just talking with your neighbors, but ultimately you'll have to have conversations with county and state legislators. And like I alluded to, the legislative process requires that your district state legislators introduce a bill, pass it through the legislature, and then ultimately the governor has to sign a bill to give your municipality the authority to establish a community preservation fund. And while the end goal is to have the governor sign a bill, ultimately, the process really does start at the local level and generating that community support and excitement that can be amplified up to your county legislators, up to the state legislators, and up to ultimately the governor's office to understand that there is enthusiasm and a desire to do this. So it really does take a village, as they say, to get this done. And I will say that there are 3 communities that are currently in this process right now: the town of Chester in Orange County, the town of Orangetown in Rockland County, and the town of Copiague in Columbia County. Each had an independent authorization bill that passed both houses of the legislature this year at the state level, and now the governor just needs to sign those bills. So we're hoping that the governor signs those bills and those 3 get independent authorization. But Scenic Hudson is also hitting this from another angle and working on a bill that would add Dutchess and Columbia counties to the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act. So we're hoping that by adding counties, instead of just going municipality by municipality, which can take a long time, that will give this broader authorization in a quicker amount of time. So whether or not you have state authorization, you can still start thinking about community preservation funds and get ready to, when you ultimately have authorization, to get started by doing some of the things that I'm going to talk about now, which are taking a look at your community's natural resource inventory maps and identifying some of the priority resources that were written into that, into the maps and into the natural resource inventory. You can also think about some of the costs that you may start to expect with the CPF process at different times during the Community Preservation Fund campaign and planning process. There will be costs associated, including the community preservation planning process that I'll talk more about in a little bit. There's maybe a public opinion poll or survey that will need to happen depending on how big your community is. That has an associated cost. Any of the costs associated with the campaign and public education piece of this, et cetera. So what are the costs, and then what are the available funding sources out there for you? Is there a local or regional partner that you can work with to get some fiscal support? You can also start to think about your community's readiness for a CPF. How prepared is your community to implement a CPF? What's the general political climate? Are there volunteers, maybe some of you on this webinar right now, that are ready to be mobilized to do this work? And then finally, what do you want to achieve with your community preservation fund? Do you have a goal in mind? Because that would really help orient you throughout this process that can admittedly be somewhat long, but having an ultimate goal, the light at the end of the tunnel, that's what you want to be working towards throughout this process. Now, I mentioned reviewing your natural resource inventory. If you have one, you can also start to look at your other prior plans and studies that your town or city has done. And you can use these plans, some of them I've listed on the slide here, to inform your community preservation plan. And what some municipalities have done have literally just pulled sections from their existing plans to populate their community preservation plan. So I've talked a lot about community preservation plan, but I haven't actually told you what it is yet. So what is a CPP and where does it come into this whole community preservation fund process? Well, the adoption of a community preservation plan, or CPP, by local law is a prerequisite for establishing a community preservation fund. And developing this plan is very similar to the process for creating an open space plan. And it's typically led by a planning consultant. And I actually see Ted Fink on this call, who has helped out with quite a few of these community preservation plans in the past. So that's an example of a planning consultant that municipalities have worked with. And it also takes a volunteer committee to help develop the plan. And within that development process, there are 5 main tasks that the volunteer committee would have to accomplish. The first one would be identifying community values, looking at the natural and cultural resource data in your community, making an inventory of them or utilizing an existing inventory, and mapping, identifying priorities like we've discussed, evaluating land use alternatives. So how to actually protect the parcels using the CPF funds. So is it a fee simple acquisition, or is it a transfer of development rights or a purchase of development rights? Identifying those for the higher priority parcels that you've identified. And then finally, just writing and revising the plan and making summary tables of ranked priorities. And the CPP actually does have to list every project that your municipality plans to undertake under the CPF. So if you want to use CPF funds to purchase a property, that property has to be identified and prioritized in your community preservation plan. So that's just a little stipulation there in the language of the law. So I mentioned the community preservation plan is one of the 3 local laws required to establish a CPF supported by a real estate transfer tax. There are 2 more. The one is adopting a local law to actually establish the community preservation fund. So just making the fund itself. And within that process, the municipal governing bodies of the town board or the city council or whatever it may be has to also establish an advisory board. So the actual putting together of the advisory board and staffing the advisory board usually doesn't happen until after the laws have passed, but actually making the advisory board as a unit happens during this process. And then finally, after adopting the community preservation plan, the municipality also has to adopt a local law imposing a real estate transfer tax of up to 2%. So the percentage is up to the municipality, but you cannot go higher than 2% under the authorizing law. And this third local law that I just mentioned is actually the law that puts the real estate transfer tax as a referendum on your ballots in November that all municipal residents have to vote on. So these three local laws are passed by the town board, but ultimately the establishment of the real estate transfer tax and community preservation fund happens with the vote in November. So I've thrown a lot at you, but I just wanted to sum it up by saying, if you decide to go forward with this process, or if you're even thinking about it, stick with those thoughts, stick with the process, because it is worth it. We've seen what community preservation funds have done in Red Hook and Marbletown and Kingston. And there's so much opportunity out there for other municipalities that have the authorization to do projects just like that. I would say collaboration and connection are integral to this process. So being in a cohort like this and attending webinars like this, collaborating with people within your community, and also municipalities that have already done this work. There are a lot out there, and there's a lot of knowledge to be shared about community preservation funds and the whole intricacies of this conservation finance mechanism. And then, like I mentioned, just coming back to keeping your end goal in mind, all of the communities that I've worked with have taken slightly different paths to community preservation fund passage and implementation. And you will ultimately find your own way, and partners like myself and Scenic Hudson and other local regional organizations can help you and guide you, so you will not be alone in this process, and you will never be alone from the beginning to the end. If you want, there will always be partners that will be able to help you every step of the way. So that is the end of my presentation, and I would love to open it up to discussion and any questions that you have. Thank you again for the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Carli. It is a complex process, isn't it? So I was hoping we could just start off with like bringing it back to you as a human who has been working on this now for quite some time. Like, do you have any anecdotes you could share with us about like how does it personally feel to be helping, to be involved in helping towns? Or like, can you share with us any sort of responses that you've gotten from people who have seen it all the way through? What does it feel like on the other end?
Yeah, for me personally, this is, don't tell my other projects, but this is my favorite thing that I get to work on, because it is not only so tangible, like passing a law and then being able to establish this conservation finance mechanism that lasts 20 plus years into the future. It's just so exciting to see what people can do with the money coming in from the real estate transfer tax. And then with the communities that I've worked with, there's only positivity. I mean, I'll say that in the communities that have passed CPFs, we've had about 70% voter support on all of the ballot referendums. So not only is there positivity on the front end of it, but after passage, people are seeing the benefits of this land being preserved in their community, and they're understanding what it can do. So I also will say that I convene a group of community preservation fund people who are like twinkle in their eye thinking about CPFs, to people like Chatham, volunteers in Chatham who have already passed community preservation funds. And it's a great way to kind of mush our minds together and think about how we can help other municipalities do this work. And so people are staying engaged even after they pass community preservation funds, because they found the process so rewarding and want to help other people do it.
Amazing. And then I also just wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about what's the role of Scenic Hudson? Is Scenic Hudson like the go-to, or are there other nonprofits that folks could consider partnering with, or like and maybe what's also the role of land conservation groups, if any?
Yeah, so I think Scenic Hudson has come out as a leader on community preservation funds because we've spent a lot of time learning about them and creating this cohort of municipalities. And we've helped shepherd 5 now through this process. So we really know the ins and outs of it, but there are definitely other local and regional not-for-profits and land conservation groups that can help out not only with technical assistance, but also fiscally as well. Like I said, not a large part, but I think a critical part of this process is getting the funding to be able to write a community preservation plan and run a campaign. Those are not cheap efforts, unless your community is really small. Um, but we've even seen with a small community, it could be, thousands of dollars. So being able to raise that money from partners like Scenic Hudson and like local land trusts or not-for-profit groups, that's a way to collaborate and get assistance from them.
Okay. Yeah. And then I think like with the Red Hook Cookingham Farm example, they had the money they had raised through their real estate transfer tax, but didn't they also get additional funds when it came to purchasing that property? Didn't they also were able to bring in other sources of funding, so you're not just relying on the funds from the real estate transfer taxes? Do I have that right?
That's correct. Yep. So they actually partnered with Scenic Hudson to preserve those 2 properties. So Scenic Hudson put in a little bit of money with the stipulation that Red Hook would come in with a match using their community preservation fund.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have some questions in the chat. Kate Butler asked, you mentioned other conservation tools beyond CPF. Could you share more about what those are?
Yeah, so I know just peripherally, so my expertise is in community preservation funds, but like Kingston did with an open space bond, for example, they bonded the purchase of that property and then they're paying it back with community preservation funds. So I know that if you don't have a CPF, there are places like the town of Bedford, for example, has an open space bond that they've been using to preserve land. So that's one example. I don't have a great amount of other examples just because, like I said, I just specifically focus on CPS, but they are out there.
Okay. And and you had mentioned the costs that come into play when you're maybe hiring a consultant to help you develop the community preservation plan in the first place. Could you talk a little bit about Hudson River Estuary Program? I believe that maybe they provide some assistance there.
Yes, the Hudson River Estuary Program can provide grants for putting together a community preservation plan, given that you're within the Hudson River estuary, like the bounds of the actual estuary, and their service area. And they've also provided a ton of technical expertise. They are really wonderful partners that many municipalities that I've worked with have gone to, just for not only knowledge, but also funding on being able to put together their community preservation plan.
Okay. And Anya asks, could you share more about the exemption around the properties below a certain threshold? And wondering, like, how does that play out over time as housing prices shift and increase? Can you build in some way to adjust it?
Yeah, that's a great question and something actually that we're workshopping a little bit. So the exemption, and I actually, maybe I didn't even mention it, but the exemption is any portion of the purchase price below the county median currently. So the county median home value in Dutchess County, for example, is for something. I don't have the exact answer, but if you buy a $500,000 home and the median is 400,000, you'd only have to pay the tax on that 100,000 above the median. And in terms of shifting home values, the county actually sets the median home value. And I don't know the timeline on when they actually adjust the county median, what they're operating from. But that would be, and the adjustments made to the exemption would be when the county reassesses the county median home value. And the town of Bedford is a special case in Westchester where all of the home values within Bedford are way higher than the county median. So the county median exemption doesn't really make sense for them because it's not making too much of a difference, especially for first-time home buyers. There's also an exemption potentially able to be built in for first-time home buyers. But so they were thinking of doing maybe a graduated tax instead, and that's something that hasn't been proven yet. We haven't seen it in action, but that's something that they were thinking about is a 1% tax on a certain threshold. And then once you hit a home value of a higher threshold, the tax would increase as an example.
Okay.
Let's go quick follow-up on that, Carly. Is that exemption, do people have to apply for it? Is it just automatic?
So it would have to be written into the law, actually, when you pass those three local laws. Looking at within the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act, there's specific language that talks about exemptions. So that would be what would authorize you to make those exemptions. But if you have independent authorization, for example, it would have to be written in there.
Okay, thanks.
Lisa asks, could you share any more about how Chester has accomplished so much? How they got started on their journey?
Yeah, I don't know too much about Chester. So I don't think I could share that much more, but I could follow up. What happens when I work with the community is they'll come to me and then we'll work together. But why I'm so excited to talk to you all today is so that I can get this information out there so that I know more about what's going on in the Hudson Valley and hopefully start to have some more of these conversations like on what Chester is doing. So I personally would love to hear more about what Chester has done and how they've accomplished as much as they have.
Okay, great. And does the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act, it's just Westchester, Ulster, and Putnam, right? And then there's a few smatterings of towns that have done it independently to get the authorization. Do you, and it sounds like you're at Scenic Hudson, you're working on trying to scoop in Dutchess, Columbia, right? Do you know why they weren't included in the first place?
I don't, but my thought is that the original sponsors of the bill were probably they had constituencies in Westchester and Putnam counties, and that's where they were focused, probably.
Okay.
But Ulster County, I mentioned on my slide, was only added in 2019. So originally it was the only two. And then Jen Metzger, when she was in the Senate, worked on a bill to add Ulster in. And in conversations with her, she said, oh, it was super easy and we were so glad to be able to do it for Ulster. So we're hoping that Dutchess and Columbia will have the same experience.
Or Jen Metzger makes it look easy, anyways.
Right, she does.
We love Jen. Olga asks, can funds be used for natural hazard mitigation?
Um, by natural hazard mitigation, meaning like flood mitigation, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, from my understanding, the funds can largely be used to preserve land. So say you're preserving a parcel that has a wetland on it. I think that would be a way, kind of a roundabout way for the ability for the municipality to mitigate flood risk by preserving wetlands, making sure that there's places for water to go and natural open spaces that have permeable surfaces. So yes, I think in a way it can be used for natural hazard mitigation, but the actual law says purchasing the land.
Hmm. Okay. And also I just wanted to invite folks, like if anybody wants to put on their video, ask a question, raise your hand. If you prefer to do that over the chat, that's also totally fine. Um, and then Anya asks, is this tax associated with increasing housing prices in the places that have implemented it? Like, are there any unintended consequences maybe to passing this additional real estate transfer tax?
Yeah, from because most of the community preservation funds that I have worked on are so recent, there hasn't been enough data to be able to reflect any changes on the back end. But from what we've seen in the municipalities that have implemented real estate transfer taxes, the Community Preservation Fund in particular, there has been no housing price impact from that real estate transfer tax.
And Carly, is there something that maybe Scenic Hudson is working on? I don't know too much about it, but isn't there maybe another piece of legislation under consideration at the state level where towns could do something, a similar sort of process, but around affordable housing?
That is correct. Yeah. So at the state level, last legislative session, we had been working on two statewide bills. One would give authorization to any municipality statewide, other than New York City, to do community preservation funds. And we were trying to go with that angle because, I mean, hey, blanket authorization for the entirety of New York State would be so awesome. We hit some obstacles with that. So ultimately it didn't pass, but there was another bill that we were working on that would do the same thing, same mechanism, but for community and affordable housing. So it would be a 0.5 real estate transfer tax that would go into a fund that would be used for affordable housing within communities. Again, that didn't pass this past legislative session, but it did pick up some other co-sponsors. It did gain some momentum. People were starting to talk about it. So acknowledging that housing and conservation are so intertwined, the idea of having a community housing fund is attractive to some municipalities to be able to put money towards affordable housing. But that there's currently no authorization to do such a thing at the moment.
Okay. How about just the process of setting up the community preservation plan and going through this whole like get out the vote and engaging with the community? Are there like other co-benefits that come from that process in and of itself?
Yeah, I think so. And at the community conversation level, I think that's a huge benefit of talking with your neighbors. And I think a lot of the communities that I've worked with have got to know their neighbors a lot better through this process and just create that greater sense of community collaboration and closeness. And then also this isn't just a way to achieve an environmental outcome. There's a lot of other outcomes that can result from doing a get out the vote campaign on um, natural resource prioritization, because there's also conversations happening about what are the other priorities in our community and how can we address those. If we can't use the community preservation fund, what else is there out there? Does our municipality really need money for affordable housing, and how can we do that? So it spurs these conversations going forward when we're talking about priorities.
And if folks on the Zoom here like are excited about this idea and they are figuring that most people in their town have no idea that this option exists, what do you think they should do?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, if people are excited about this idea, but they figure probably most people in their town have never heard of it, what do you recommend for how they could tune people into it?
Well, they're welcome to have a conversation with me. I have some handouts that kind of go over everything that I talked about in this presentation today, and talking to the town board and kind of sussing out the interest in it is a great first step. Talking with neighbors about the need to protect open spaces and farmland and natural resources. And I think gathering interest interested people and interested volunteers in actually taking on this work too is something that can result from those conversations. But really, I think what you said, it starts from just generating excitement and interest and talking to people about it, because I think a lot of people don't know that this conservation finance mechanism exists, and that so many municipalities, even despite it only being in 3 counties and a smattering of others, have the ability to do this. And we're really encouraging people to take advantage of the authorization, because we've seen that the process of granting authorization for people who want it, it can be kind of a long process, as we've seen in the past couple of legislative sessions. So if you have authorization, utilize it if you can.
Thanks. Linda Garrett in the chat says communities can also partner with local land trusts to leverage this funding to match state and federal farmland protection grant programs. And she gives the example of Peconic in Long Island. Great. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Linda is a staff member of American Farmland Trust.
Oh, great. Thanks for coming, Linda. Well, I think one of the great things about having you here, Carli, is you could also warn us about any of the pitfalls that we might want to avoid if we're interested in advocating for this in our own towns. Are there any common pitfalls to share?
Yeah, I think the first one that comes to mind is timing. And we always encourage people to work back from a goal of, say you want to put a ballot referendum on the ballot in November 2026. Work backwards from there, give yourself at least a year to be able to write the plan, pass the local laws, educate your community, hold the campaign, and ultimately, hopefully, pass the CPF. But we really think that it takes a year plus to be able to do this successfully, so you're not feeling crunched for time, because there are certain instances that the Board of Elections needs you to get certain things in by. So like your local laws need to be in by a certain time, and you have to vote on them and pass things by another certain time. So there is a timeline that you can work off of. But if you miss one of those deadlines, it's not going to happen for your community, and we don't want that to happen. So giving yourself an ample amount of time would be my first and largest recommendation.
Okay, because you're probably building the momentum as you're doing the plan and passing the laws, people are engaged. And then if you just miss the deadline, it's like, now you have to wait another year to kind of get out the vote moment to happen for the referendum.
Right. And the momentum is something that we really try to capitalize on when we're doing these things, not just to keep this in people's minds so that they're not surprised when it comes up on the ballot, but also we have had in the Hudson Valley successful CPF passages for the past 5 years now. Well, 4 years, hopefully 5. The town of Rochester is actually going to have a CPF on their ballot this November, Rochester and Ulster County. So hopefully we'll have a successful CPF every year, and keeping that momentum going and having more communities be able to successfully pass them, that we want to show that there is a series, a wave kind of interest in this and successful passages of this. So another pitfall would be if your municipality doesn't have the political will to do something like this, if people in your municipality just aren't really interested in a real estate transfer tax, or if they're skeptical about it. We've had some communities do a poll or a community survey, and it comes back saying, well, maybe only 50 to 60% of people would be interested in this. And at that time, we would encourage people to take a step back, do some more community education and outreach, and then try maybe another year, because we don't want something to come on the ballot and then ultimately fail. I mean, that would really set a town back quite far. So we want to have success the first time we try. So making sure you're prepared to do that.
Okay, so you do some kind of testing of the waters with some polling first to understand the appetite for it.
Correct. Yeah. Highly recommended.
Hmm. Okay.
I wonder, Carly, if a community's priorities change, let's say they do this whole plan, they think they know what they want to do for the long term, then something comes up and they want to do something different, can they revise their plan after they've passed the whole thing?
That's a great question. Yeah. My understanding is that you could revise the plan afterwards, because I'm sure, properties change hands and plans change, and there has to be some flexibility with that. So yeah, I would say that the CPP that you write is a great starting point and a working point, but it's not the end all be all.
Great. And is that does that again have to be passed in some way, either with the municipality or is it with the state?
No, it would just be municipal passage, reauthorization. Yeah.
Great. I think Olga had a question. Could a real estate transfer tax be applied in ways other than the CPF?
Yeah, there are other real estate transfer taxes that are actually in effect right now. One of them I know goes towards the Environmental Protection Fund, the statewide Environmental Protection Fund. But we are talking about real estate transfer tax going towards a CPF. So it's a mechanism in its own. It's not specific to the Community Preservation Fund.
Wonder
It's
if you have,
Olga. Sorry, I wanted to explain that question. I'm in the town of Highlands, which is right next to West Point. We do not have really a lot of open land that we could dedicate these kinds of funds to. But we have areas that need attention. Like I said, hazard mitigation. We have common areas which are deeply affected by flooding, but that are individually owned. And, so we would almost have to like purchase pieces of property, personal properties to affect some mitigation strategy. So, I mean, really applying it to an open space plan is not really effective for us. We need to be able to use the money more creatively. So I need to, I guess, dig into how else we could use that if we go, if we try to implement it.
Yeah, maybe it would be helpful to just understand a little bit of the nuance around the definition of what does open space mean? Does it necessarily mean that there's like no buildings on the property, or are there rules around that?
Yeah, that it's a good question. And another thing, I actually have the attorneys at Scenic Hudson looking into the nuances of that right now. So unfortunately, they haven't come back to me yet. But I know that in the law, and I can share too, like the language of the law, it says like specifically it can be used for this, this, and this. But in terms of the interpretation of that, like what does open space mean or what does preservation mean? Um, that's something that I'm trying to suss out and see if there's more flexibility than what is actually written into the law, like what the actual language says. But that's a task for a lawyer, and I am not one, unfortunately. But what I can say is that because I'm going to be looking into this, I can share what I find, Olga, with you and anybody else who's interested. I'd be happy to do that, because you are not alone in that. There are many municipalities that don't have a lot of open space to preserve anymore, whether it's developed or already protected too. So it's something that I've come across enough times where we need to have that information. So happy to share that with you, Olga.
Thank you so much.
And one clarifying question around the real estate transfer tax. Is it just for residential properties, or is it any property sales in the municipality?
That is a good question, and one that I'm going to have to go into the law and check again. My understanding is that it's residential properties, but I could be wrong. So I will check on that and follow up because I don't want to say something that is wrong.
Okay. Yeah. And then I was also really struck by something you said, Carly, where you were like, in a way you could think of this as a new a new member of the community coming in and buying a house and kind of like in a way showing this investment in like in the natural resources and the character of the town. And I was just wondering, like, when does that moment actually happen? And what does that look like? Is that literally when someone like sits down with their real estate person signing their mortgage paperwork? Like, I wonder how that's presented to people. And like, that my fantasy is that there's like some kind of ceremony where it's like, welcome to the community. You just contributed this money towards our goal of protecting this piece of land or something. But wondering what the reality of that moment is.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because we often have real estate interests that are really opposed to real estate transfer taxes and this kind of mechanism. And that's one of the obstacles that we faced at the state level is realtors saying, hey, we will never support a real estate transfer tax because we just don't like them and we never will. Um, and so when it comes to a local ballot measure, for example, in New Paltz, we had the realtors come out and outspend us 3-1 on our campaign. They did a counter campaign. But what was really interesting about that is the flyers that the New Paltz realtors were sending and distributing in New Paltz came from an Albany address, an address outside of New Paltz. So all these New Paltz people were thinking, who are these outside interests trying to tell us what to do with our community and what to do with our real estate? So it ended up kind of working counter to the interests of the realtors. And we still had about 70% voter support there in New Paltz. But it is a talking point when purchasing real estate in a community. The realtor has to say, oh, by the way, there is a 2% or 1.5% real estate transfer tax that will go into open space. And hopefully the person would appreciate that and celebrate that, like you said, Vanessa, because they're paying into the community that they're going to be living in for the foreseeable future. So we would hope that it would be a positive thing, but it has been framed as a negative thing by the realtors.
Can I just add, because I have friends that live in Warwick and they were one of the original and probably what are there, two or three in Orange County that have um this transfer tax. And that's one of the things that they said in their community. The realtors were like, absolutely not. But now that they've preserved their area to the beauty that it is, now it's a selling point for them and it's worked to their benefit. So, but Warwick's, is there any other in Orange County? There's that lovely little belt that you've mentioned, right? Rockland, Orange, and Sullivan County that are not allowed to have this transfer tax for some people may know the obvious reason, but so some people aren't interested in being part of the community to that degree, right? They want to come in and build it. So this is something that they are putting a halt to, especially in our area. So for those of you that have it, congratulations.
Carly, you mentioned some examples of what towns have done with this when they've passed it. I wonder if you could give us more stories or more examples of the great things that they've been able to do, some of them, or a bit more, details on what some municipalities have done with the money that they've raised.
Yeah, I would love to. Unfortunately, because a lot of these are so new, they're still just kind of trying to build up that funding base before they embark on a project. Like Gardner, for example, passed their CPF at the same time as Marbletown, but hasn't embarked on a project yet. So we have a couple of examples of communities that haven't done anything with their CPF monies yet. I will say the town of Chatham, and I saw Danelle weigh in, the supervisor of the town of Chatham. They're holding a meeting in September to bring together all of the parties that own land that was identified in the community preservation plan to talk to them about the benefits of preserving their land. A lot of them are probably farmers. And if Donal is still here, I'm sure he can jump in and explain more about what they're trying to do. But that's a way that they're using this CPF effort to start talking to community members and start talking to landowners and be able to have what I would assume to be a smoother process in talking to them instead of people saying, oh, well, my property was identified on your list. Like, what does that mean for me? So having those conversations is something that these communities are starting to do as well. And Danelle, I would open it up to you if you're available, if you wanted to talk more about that.
Sure, if you wouldn't mind, Paige and Vanessa.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
First and foremost, the town of Chatham couldn't have done this without Carli and Scenic Hudson. So for the other municipalities on this call, I mean, definitely look them up because they were absolutely instrumental in our success. In addition to the Hudson River Estuary Program, which was so critical in the development of our community preservation plan. We are in the very nascent stages of our, I guess you could call our advisory board moving forward. As Carli mentioned, we're going through looking at all the identified parcels and very delicately working with, our other partners in addressing these landowners and trying to educate them, on the preservation mechanism that we're offering and the benefits of it. So we don't have a project yet that we can say is successful, but we are working diligently to get there. We've only had our real estate transfer tax on the books for about 16 months. And it did garner about $330,000 in the first year. So that's great, as it's been mentioned before, for leveraging, especially with ag and markets, as the town, our enabling language prioritized farmland protection over everything else, even though it did list, as Carli had mentioned, some of the other factors like open space and ecologically sensitive areas and historic sites and things like that. So we're just starting. It's a a learning curve for our advisory board and everyone else involved. But we have Carli, we have the Hudson River Estuary Program, we have Columbia Land Conservancy, the CLC, that has experience in our area. That's they've been tremendous advocates and instruments of preservation here, really helping many farms and other areas conserve their land. So it's about getting everybody together and educating, the landowners and the public, I guess, for those looking to go through this process, educating on the public on the mechanism, the tax, the plan, and things like that. So.
Donal, could you speak a little bit more about what does it mean to be preserving farmland? Like what sort of mechanisms or techniques are you using to preserve farmland? How does that work?
Well, what we're looking at, I think our main focus will be obviously the purchase of development rights, the PDRs for the town. And we'd be working with CLC especially to store those development rights and to monitor the areas that are preserved. So that's those development rights. You have an appraisal process of land with controls and land without it. And that's your baseline for the expenditure of funds, I'd say.
That's great. Thanks for explaining, Janelle. You all are so proactive, and we're hoping that Chatham's participation in Funding Futures will also help that process. But I just want to say that our conversation with you a long time ago was a real inspiration in terms of how you organized around these CPP, CPF, real estate transfer tax was one of the things that really inspired us to create this program. So thank you for all the work that you guys are doing.
Well, thank you guys for putting on, this seminar, and I'm also very, comforted and enthusiastic about hearing about Red Hook and Cookingham Farm. When we have farmland, we need the farmers to work it. We need the young families and the generational housing. So it's good to see housing and preservation mentioned in the same sentence. I think there's the Alliance, Hudson Valley Alliance for Conservation and Housing as well, which Patterns for Progress is now, I think, a strong lead in, and it's good that those things are mentioned because we still need to remember that with all these, heightened real estate prices and also the loss of inventory, that we need to keep housing stock in mind.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Actually, as Carli mentioned, and as you're mentioning, Steve Rosenberg is actually going to come and speak to the Funding Futures Fellows, and we're going to also open that session up in September. And so look for that. If you're signed up to our newsletter, there'll be an announcement about that and an invitation to you all. And
Yeah,
they
that's
work
it's the
to,
the Alliance for Conservation and Affordable Housing that Steve Rosenberg and Pattern for Progress are part of, and maybe Scenic Hudson too. Yeah. And I think that the date for that is October 1st.
right. So
Yeah.
they work in ways to help. It seems to be a conflict between developing affordable housing and preserving, conserving land. They work to make the two agree and so that it's not a conflict.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone's visited Cookingham Farm. I did when Red Hook kind of had an opening conversation about it. And so they took the arable farmland and they preserved that. And then they cordoned off a section where they're trying to, I believe, actually build some of those houses on site with panel manufacturing and the shop of the old farm and blend that into the landscape there. So I really look forward to seeing how that project goes because I think it would be a great benchmark and model for, future projects.
Yeah.
But I have to leave, unfortunately, but I can't say enough for Carli and Scenic Hudson, and you guys as well, Partners for Climate Action Hudson Valley. But Carli has been phenomenal for us. And as she mentioned, for these other aspiring towns, it's just been such a fantastic resource. So the town of Chatham is truly grateful to everyone.
Thanks, Donald.
Grateful for you
Thank
too.
you, guys.
Thank you.
Um, Joe Montuari had a question. Can the CPF be established at any municipal level, village, town, or county?
It can be established at the town or city level, not county level. There's authorization at the county level, but actually implementing the CPF happens at the municipal level.
Carly, do you get any other like frequently asked questions?
I think, let me think. There have been a lot of really good questions asked today. And as highlighted, some of them I'm actively working on too. So it's great that these questions are being asked, especially the stipulations of the law and what can actually be accomplished using community preservation funds. Um, and I think another question is that I would get is who else is talking about this? How can I start getting involved? How can I learn more? And one of those ways would be reaching out to me, and you could join the cohort of municipalities that convenes every month. It's our little community preservation fund coalition. Danelle and Mary Gale from Chatham, if you know them, they're very active participants and are more than willing to provide their wisdom and expertise and lessons learned from their previous experience going through this process. And we just open it up to conversation every month. So if anyone is looking to have more conversations like this, that's when they happen. And I can share the next meeting with Vanessa and Paige to send out to all of you if you're interested.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know Joe, who's here, is runs Sustainable Putnam Valley. So as one of the counties that has the authorization, Joe, have you heard of any towns over there who are interested?
No, it's Sustainable Putnam, by the way. It's
Oh,
the
sorry.
yeah, Putnam Valley is a town
Yeah,
within
no,
Putnam
I'm
County.
sorry. I
Uh,
misspoke.
yeah, we're a much bigger organization than
Yeah.
that.
Sorry.
No, I haven't, but there has been a lot of talk or a lot of really action by farms in our county and farmers. And our county government was denying entry into our agricultural district for years. And that's just gotten turned around. And I think it's really all about development interests and real estate interests that have been kind of throwing up roadblocks um, to our farms. And I wish we did have a community preservation fund right now in the town of Carmel, where I live, because there is a long-standing farm that got sold to a developer, and there's storage units being put in there. It's such a shame because it's uh, prime farmland, and some of the last prime farmland in this town. And there's actually a farmer who's trying to buy back some of that from the developer to put in a farm. And the town is supporting it, but there's not, it's a expensive piece of property, so I don't know if it's going to happen.
Hmm. Maybe look into that bond mechanism that Kingston used. Yeah. Well, are there any other questions from folks in the audience here? We can end a bit early if we feel like we are complete.
I have one more maybe quick question. Is there a time frame under which the funds must be used, like where they have to actually take action? I'm just wondering, like, properties aren't always available, so even if they're identified as high priority or priorities, or they really want to hold out for something, what does that look like?
Yeah, great question. I'm thinking of that. Well, I know on the authorization side, a community authorized to establish a CPF in 2008 has 20 years to actually implement the CPF. So I'm assuming that it would be on a 20-year timeline because there's also a reauthorization of CPF, the actual CPF that has to happen. And I think it's at that 20-year interval again. I think Red Hook actually is going to go through it in the near future because they just or they had their CPF originally authorized in 2006. So we're looking at 2026 for a reauthorization. So there is a timeline in which you would have to reauthorize it. I don't know if the funds have to be used before reauthorization happens. I would hope not, because I think there's probably a lot of money in Red Hook's Community Preservation Fund right now that would go away otherwise. But I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I do know that there's that 20-year interval of time.
And that's kind of standard, or is that each town determines whether it's 20 years or 15 or
That's standard.
okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Carli, for sharing your expertise with us. This was really amazing to get you to share your amazing level of knowledge and for such a good cause. So thank you very much.
So
And
thank
we
you
did
for climate action. Appreciate it.
great. All right, everyone, take care.